Hello, welcome back. Today, what we want to do is look at the book of Job. At the very least, look at some of the central issues related to this particular book. And as we know, a major concern that universally occupies the minds and the hearts of mankind is the problem of human suffering. This, of course, is complicated even more so when God's people suffer. Hence, the question that arises in those moments is, why me, Lord? Why now? What did I do to deserve this? And so the book of Job, therefore, addresses a major question that faces men and women. Are God's ways just? Are God's ways just? So the place of Job in the Old Testament, we know that Job is the first of the 5 books commonly referred to as the books of poetry or the books of wisdom. These, of course, include Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Solomon. And the majority of the book consists of Job and his dialogue with his friends. However, he is not the author of this book. It may have likely been an Israelite, since he used the name God in his covenant-style name of Yahweh. The word Yahweh appears 25 times in the prologue as well as the epilogue, yet only one time within the framework of the discussion, chapters 3 to 37, the main body, the main dialogue between Job and his friends. However, Job's friends used a more generic name when referencing a god. Some 50 times they used Eloah about 40 times, and Elohim some 4 times, that all translate as God. Shaddai about 30 times, meaning Almighty. This indicates that the speakers lived before or beyond the influence of the religion of Israel during this patriarchal period, or in the area outside of the Promised Land. Among the names that have been suggested as possible authors of the book of Job are Job, but of course more than likely was not, Elihu, Moses, Solomon, Isaiah, Hezekiah, Jeremiah, Baruch, and Ezra. However, similar to the book of Hebrews, the best answer to this riddle of who is the author of Job is we simply do not know. Although difficult to place, Job may have lived perhaps between Genesis 11 and 12 or shortly after Abraham. The book itself, the dating of it is not easily ascertained. The reason for this is because there are 2 dates involved, which are one, the date in which Job lived, and the date of the composition of the book. Job probably lived during the millennium 2000 to 1000 BC. And here are some reasons why we believe that this is the case. Some of it is simply from the internal evidence that we see in the book itself. We see in the text that Job lived 140 years after the events of the book, which would be consistent with the amount of years lived during the patriarchal period. His lifespan must have been somewhere around 200 years. Second, Job's wealth is described in terms of livestock rather than gold or silver. Third, Job is the priest of his family and offers sacrifices like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Fourth, Job lacks reference to Israel, the Exodus, the Mosaic Law, or even the tabernacle, which were all central to the Jewish faith. 5, Job's social unit is a patriarchal family clan in accordance with Abraham's time. 6, Job's servants are murdered by the Chaldeans, who are nomads and not city dwellers. And 7th, Job uses the patriarchal name of Shaddai. All of these seem to suggest a timing, the timing of the life of Job during the patriarchal period, though the dating of the book should be seen as anonymous. We are better off receiving this book as a gift from God to all righteous sufferers at all times. And throughout the book are occasional references to farming, rivers, hills, none of which would disallow the high desert of the Edomite plateau. But the thunder and lightning storms, as well as the unwelcome east wind, are all characteristics of that area. Even hail, ice, snow, mentioned several times, are known to occur there. This would be in the land of Uz, as best as we can guess, was in the area of northern Saudi Arabia or southern Jordan, which since the time of the patriarchs has been called Edom. And the names of Job's friends and their homes also point to locales in the desert country east and south of the Dead Sea. Now, as far as the date and setting of the book, the attributes that stand out in the book of Job are sovereignty, omnipotence, omniscience, and justice. These are some of the main attributes of God that are highlighted within this book. Now, less prominent are mercy, love, and goodness. Until the Lord appeared out of the whirlwind, Job complained that God was apathetic. He was blind to injustice. He was hidden and unresponsive. For the four counselors, the justice of God was most prominent in their theology, with sovereignty just as important. Therefore, perhaps a really easy way of memorizing this book, or at least the main theme of this book, would be suffering and the sovereignty of God. Because in the midst of all this suffering, God remains sovereign throughout the process. Now, the reader, of course, is not privy to much of Job's view of God after God's speech, since Job said so little. Presumably, he would have acknowledged God's power, faithfulness, generosity, and mercy. That God spoke to Job at all was ultimate honor for Job, and by itself would have rectified most of his misconceptions. Suffering is certainly an important fact, an aspect within the book, and we get to see Job wrestling with that throughout the majority of the book until the latter part. He gets some insight into what is actually taking place. It appears that the book of Job is a canonical corrective against faulty reasoning regarding suffering as established by Job's friends in that time. And to be honest, even to this day, there is still some faulty understanding of why the righteous suffer, or even why there is suffering in the world as a whole. So the basic premise found within the book of Proverbs is the doctrine of retribution, as represented by Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. And here's what they're saying. If you sin, then you will suffer. If you sin, then you will suffer. This cause and effect that we see them wrestling with and really making these accusations toward Job. So the problem with Job's friends is that they went too far. Because you see, though the premise holds some truth, these men actually reversed the cause and effect and concluded that if you suffer, then you must have sinned. If you suffer, then you must have sinned. Now, in light of Deuteronomy 28, the covenant did state that obedience brought forth blessings while disobedience produced cursing. So there is some truth to that. However, the reversal of the cause and effect was where they were wrong. If you suffer, then you must have sinned. Meaning then that anytime anyone suffered, it was because they had sinned. And this simply is not true. Neither is it in the case of Job, nor is it in many other circumstances. So in reversing the order, they asserted that all suffering is explained by personal sin. Therefore, suffering now becomes the revealing sign of sin. In other words, since Job is suffering, he must have sinned, which is the charge that they leveled against him. So Job determines that personal sin is not the only reason for suffering in this world. And when we fast forward to the New Testament, we understand this truth as well. John 9 and 10 help us get a better understanding of how God was glorified through the suffering of his faithful servants. So it is not always the case. In similar fashion, Paul is told in 2 Corinthians 12 that God's grace is sufficient for his thorn in the flesh. It would be absurd to assume that Paul was suffering for personal sin given the context of his argument. And so what you see is these three individuals and then a fourth young theologian who come in and seek to provide understanding for Job's circumstances. But in doing so, they apply a theology of retribution that is simply not true in the case of Job. So Eliphaz can be understood as a theologian, Bildad as a historian or legalist, Zophar a moralist and a dogmatist, whereas Elihu is a young theologian and also a legalist who believes he has to put his 2 cents in as well. The book of Job has a very unique structure that with its 42 chapters, there's somewhat of a chiastic structure found within the book. On the first level, we see God's design for man's life, which is blessing. And we see that in chapters 1 to 5. But we also see that on the back end of it as well, that God's purpose for man's suffering is more blessing. Chapter 42, 10 to 17. 2, God's careful care under which the righteous man suffers. And we see that in 1:6 to 2:13. And God's full wisdom and power in controlling every aspect of our life can be seen from chapters 38 to 42:9. At the very center of the book is the danger of holding incomplete concepts of why man suffers, chapters 3 to 37. And this is the central part of the book. But ultimately, we need to understand that what God designs for man's life is blessing. The structure of the book then can be produced in a very simple outline. In chapters 1 to 3, we see Job's dilemma. We are introduced to the character, we are introduced to his background, we are introduced to his family, his circumstances, and what's ultimately leading to his suffering. Now, of course, Job is not privy to the dialogue between the evil one and God. He is simply receiving the suffering and pain and anguish that comes with loss of family, loss of fortunes, loss of everything with the exception of his faith. The second section is Job's defense. Chapters 4 to 37, we see Job's defense against these three friends and then that other young man who steps in at the very end. And lastly, we see Job's deliverance. Chapters 38 to 42, we see God coming in a whirlwind and responding and assuring this Job that he is still sovereign, he is fully in control, and he does so through the explanation of the creation and how he has sustained the universe from its inception, and therefore he needs to trust in the Lord and not question him. So in keeping with other wisdom literature, Job was intended for all people of all times. The book lacks the historical events along with theological issues relevant only to a specific time. The author created a universal and timeless perspective, to which August H. Conkle provides a wonderful insight for us. He says, the author of Job was an open-minded genius with all-embracing sympathies. He was able to five fair and eloquent expressions to the accepted religious doctrines of his day, but also able to challenge the adequacy of those views. He did not answer the problem of how a good God could allow evil to exist in the world, but instead presented the truth about God and the world in a manner that not only stimulates pondering on the ancient puzzle, but also brings comfort to all those in the throes of pain. And so this is why this is such a helpful book for the saints of all generations, because it really provides a great deal of comfort for those in the throes of pain. So with that, I do want to spend a little bit of time dealing with this very issue of the doctrine of suffering. We want to first look at Satan's view. His view is that people believe in God only when they are prospering and not suffering. From a biblical perspective, however, this is completely wrong, incomplete. Job's friend's view was that suffering is God's judgment for sin. Though there may be some truth to that, it is not always true, as evidenced in this book. Elihu's view, suffering is God's way of teaching, disciplining, and refining. Though that's true, it is also incomplete. And lastly, God's view. Suffering causes believers to trust God for who He is and not just for what He does. In other words, we need to continue to trust in His character. We need to continue to trust in His outworkings in the world, even if we cannot fully understand Him, even if our circumstances fog up our perspective. We need to believe based on our convictions rather than on emotions, rather than on the pain and suffering that we might be enduring at the present time. So then, why do God's people suffer? Let me give you some main reasons why God's people suffer. We suffer, of course, because we live in a fallen world where sin reigns in the hearts of men. And this was evidenced from as early on as Genesis 3 and Romans chapter 8. However, we can rest assured also, as Romans 8:28 reveals to us, that God is still sovereign and He works all things for the good for those who have been called according to His purpose. Secondly, we suffer because of personal sin, and we reap what we sow, as we see in places like Galatians 6:7-9. We also sometimes suffer because of God's discipline, according to Hebrews chapter 12. Next, we may suffer because of our faith, especially when we take a stand on biblical issues. We may be persecuted by this world. We may be persecuted by family. We may be persecuted by friends, colleagues, etc., all because we are taking a stand for righteousness. And so we ought not be surprised, Peter tells us, when these fiery trials come our way, as if something strange were happening. And so these are the words of the Apostle Peter. The Apostle Paul will speak of these things as well. Chapter 1 of Philippians, he told the Philippians while in house arrest, he reminds them that this is what we've been called for, suffering as well. Suffering, then, should not make us forgetful. God is still king. He is still on the throne. He is still sovereign. He is still the Lord. Suffering also forces us to turn to trust in God's unlimited resources instead of our limited resources. Suffering forces us to either become better or to become bitter. And I'm reminded of the circumstances of Naomi and Ruth. Both had suffered a great deal. Both had suffered loss. And yet that same situation caused one to become better and the other one to become bitter. Let us respond appropriately and let us become better through our own sufferings. Suffering is meant to advance God's plan in our lives. It is meant to develop faithful witness. It is to develop our capacity to comfort others as well, to develop our spiritual growth, It helps us to get back on the spiritual track, which we sometimes get off track because of sin or the cares of this world. It is to develop faithful obedience. And no other passage highlights this truth better than Hebrews 5:8, when we are told that Jesus Christ himself, the Son of God, the Messiah, the God-man, that he learned obedience, we're told, through his suffering. And so if Jesus Christ endured and learned obedience through his suffering, then we should expect that is the same pathway that God has designed for us as well. Instead, we ought to ask some appropriate questions in the midst of our suffering. How am I responding? Is God pleased with the way that I am responding? Or how should I respond? Am I learning from this suffering? Can I still have joy and peace in the midst of this, given the fact that that is what God has given us through faith in Jesus Christ? Does my response demonstrate faith, love, or love for God, love for others, love for Christ? Does it demonstrate Christ-like character? Am I moping around, whining, and complaining about my circumstances? Or in the midst of my pain, in the midst of my suffering, I am still showing Christ-like characteristics, Christ-like love and care and concern for the needs of others? Am I still practicing those things that are pleasing to God, the spiritual disciplines? Is my commitment still firm and steadfast in the Lord? What would the Lord have me do in the midst of these circumstances? Or how can I use this situation? How can I use this pain in my life to really be of benefit to others? How can I learn from this so that God will redeem it, so that when others are facing similar situations, I can then step in and provide some level of comfort? And so this is what the book of Job does. It reveals to us how to appropriately analyze, understand, and respond to suffering, of which at times we cannot fully understand. And throughout the book, what you see is the wrestling back and forth between Job and his friends. And you'll also see that progressively throughout the book, Job's responses tend to be lengthier than that of his friends. Even at some point, he ends up cutting off his friends because he has simply had enough. And he does not believe that they are adding anything new. And instead of being his comforters, they have come and become his accusers. So the book of Job is a rich book that will provide a great deal of comfort to us and provide some answers in dealing with suffering and pain in this world. And yet God remains sovereign in the midst of those circumstances. Thank you so much, and I hope you enjoy your reading through the book and enjoy the dialogue and, of course, the epilogue of how God brings this together, which is a blessing to mankind.